Brother Mark, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I've come today to hear your story. How did your journey to Islam begin?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think when we talk about my journey to Islam, it's very much related around my personal relationship with God. And
You already had one?
Yes, and that later in my life, later in the journey, I realized the importance of the personal relationship with God within Islam, and that's one of the pullers towards Islam for me, was that was something that I recognized and that was important to me. So I was very lucky in the way that I was brought up. My parents brought me up as nominally Christian, with an Anglican background. But at a very young age, I also went to school in what's now Zimbabwe, at a school that St. Michael's.
Is that where you were born, in Zimbabwe?
I was born in Zambia.
Zambia?
Yeah. So it's later we moved to Zimbabwe, and I went to the school called St. Michael's, and that was run by Augustine nuns. And we also had a very close family who were Catholics in my life. So I've had these very positive relationships with particularly Christianity, Judaism, and in my early life. And so I've always had a rather positive attitude towards faith and religion. And so so the experience of that was I was nominally a Christian. And then another.
And people in the former colonies usually tend to be more religious, right?
No, I wouldn't say so. It's just you had is that St. Michael's was run by the Jesuits, and
who are Catholics.
The senior school, the Catholic Jesuits, and they were the intellectuals, and so it's part of the kind of their role out in Africa was to teach people and things, and the junior school was run by the Augustine nuns, who were just lovely. Later in my life, I moved. My children were born in Ireland, and I heard such different stories that people had with nuns there, and being brought up by nuns, and it was a very negative story that they had. So, but luckily enough, when I was young, I had these kind of positive stories around these various schools of thought within Christianity. And then I was very lucky. From 12 for many years, even after I left school, I worked with somebody who ran the school. It was a very unconventional school that I went to in Kent in the UK. So we moved to the UK when I was 10,
mm-hmm.
And I went to the school when I was 12. And the headmaster of that school was very much an intellectual. He was from a colonial background. And he was one of those people who was not a person of faith, but was very, very knowledgeable about Christianity and the Bible, and had this kind of respect for certain parts of it, which again, put me onto this journey of being comfortable around faith. And so I didn't think much about my faith. I just felt that I was nominally a Christian. And
you took it for granted.
Took it for granted, and it wasn't a big deal in any way. And so then that upbringing kind of set me up. And over the years, I moved much more secularly. I wasn't thinking about God in the terms that one would normally kind of, from a faith point of view. I was just thinking in a much more secular way, and so that was me right up until kind of adulthood. And then two things happened. One was, and I'm not normally influenced by a book, but a great friend of mine, when I went to visit him out in Australia, his father gave me a book called A Time to Change by David Suzuki, which was a very important book about the environment. written by a secular person, very secular view of environmentalism. And that really woke me up to the environment, because I'd always been brought up with a respect for the environment in places like Africa. And from the headmaster of that school, it was very much about the natural world. And this kind of brought that together for me. And then when I was lucky enough to be, I was a scuba diving instructor in South Africa. So when I moved out from the UK, I went to South Africa as an adult, and I was, as I said, I was a scuba diving instructor, but I was lucky enough to dive with
Cape Town, Durban?
Durban mainly. But I lived in Johannesburg, so it was really weird because we were miles and miles from the sea. But when I moved back down to Durban, I was very lucky to be able to dive with the scientists from the Oceanographic Research Institute. And there was never really a mix between sports divers and these guys. So that was a big kind of change that they took me, under their wing. And so one of the opportunities I got was to do a lot of very boring work, sitting in the sand, not doing anything. And I had this one opportunity when I was sitting there, and a mantis shrimp was doing its housekeeping. A mantis shrimp is a small, beautifully colored little shrimp. And I was able to watch him for a long time, which you're not usually able to do when you're diving. You're usually kind of moving around and, trying to show divers this. And
because you were sitting on the sand.
And I was sitting on the sand, and I had this opportunity to do nothing but think about this mantis shrimp. And the closer I looked at it, the more I saw the science of God. The more I thought, this isn't an accident. This isn't, there is a design here.
SubhanAllah.
And the design is beautiful. And the design is perfect. And so it was quite a kind of epiphany moment for me. But that God, was very much just the deity. I think I've always, so I moved towards this kind of idea. I mean, I was at one stage, somebody kind of termed the word panentheism with me. But it wasn't about worshipping nature. It was about God and nature being
one and the same.
One and the same. Okay. And so when I then moved to Ireland, where I met my wife, and my wife is from Saudi Arabia, and she is she's from two amazing families. She was born in Jeddah, and her mother's from the Hijaz, and her father, although he was essentially Bahraini, his family were from Najd, and
well, the families there are everywhere. Same family,
very
spread
much so.
Around the
very
area,
much so.
Yeah.
And so, but they were prominent families, and so I met my wife in Ireland. She was working as a surgeon. And
was that in Dublin?
That was down near Waterford in the south of Ireland. And I was at a bit of a loss in my life at that point. I'd left South Africa.
But did you marry her before converting?
Did I marry her before converting? No. I converted.
Because you said you met your wife.
Yes, I did. Hold on. Did I marry? Stop. Did I marry her before converting? I converted and then I married her.
Ah, okay.
So it was being exposed to her, and then her family, who I met, and my feelings toward Islam had never been particularly negative. Maybe negative towards some Muslims, but
where had you any prior exposure to Islam?
No,
because you've been in areas there were Muslims.
Yes, I mean my biggest,
South Africa, for instance.
I have very few regrets, but one of my regrets is that I never knew more about the Muslim community in South Africa because of the way that apartheid worked.
Yeah, true.
We didn't mix, and they were.
Although there is a very strong community in Durban.
Huge, yeah, and since then I've met people around that, and I just thought I was there, and I never found any of that.
So
out.
It was actually before the 90s that you were in South Africa.
Yeah, I was there from. I was there when I was young, as well. I lived in Durban when I was before I was 10, and then I went back again. And so, yeah, it was. I was very lucky, and I feel very privileged that not only was I there for the first election, but the first full election, but there was a referendum before then. And I think that's probably was more important. It was this.
Was it 1994? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1994. And it's one of the things I show my kids is the stamp that I took that referendum. But yes, I knew very little. I mean, I knew them, and I knew one or two, but I knew very little about Islam.
So actually, your real exposure to Islam was when you became acquainted with the lady who became your wife.
With
afterwards.
my wife, yeah, absolutely. Although my folks had been very influenced when they had lived in Zanzibar. Dad was he was in charge of half of the police, so it was kind of very colonial. But it's, so I've always had this, and the guy who influenced me at the school, he was brought up in India. And so, it's not like I was unfamiliar with it, but I was unfamiliar with it in the kind of religious terms. Like it was more of an Oriental admiration.
Like a culture.
Yeah, definitely a culture. And so it was when I was looking at when I was beginning to find out about the kind of faith, and there were aspects that were coming out through Nashwa about things like the personal relationship between you and God, and like the massive importance in good manners towards other people. Beautiful aspects, which I'm not saying don't exist elsewhere, but I love the emphasis of them.
Well, they do
within
exist.
This faith.
It's just that in Islam they are part of the religion itself.
Yeah,
part of the faith.
Yeah, and so my exposure to Islam was very gentle in the sense that I was encountering people who were living that way.
Was your wife from a religious family?
I suppose you'd say yes, but in that kind of normative way in the Middle East,
conventional.
Yeah, very conventional. And other people would say they were very religious. They themselves would always point at somebody in the family. Now that's the religious one, you know what I mean?
Yes.
But
it's a relative thing, I think.
Yeah, but most of them are. They're not like the kind of Wahhabism that I'd expected, when they
well, not in Jeddah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the Jeddah community is a bit more open, more liberal, if I may use the word. I mean, in relative terms.
Yeah.
And probably the Bahraini roots.
Yeah. And I mean, my wife's grandfather was an important judge in Kuwait. And he always had a Bible in his library. So so she came from this very kind of open idea. And also, my wife had come to work in Ireland because she was really, as a professional, she was butting heads against the attitudes towards women that really didn't work for her there.
So.
But all of her family that I met who came over, etc., they just lived this idea of making one feel comfortable. There was no pressure. There was no the whole idea of there being no compulsion in Islam, etc. This was very much the way they were, and so this just attracted me. I just thought this is who I've always been and who I'd like to be, and so then the next step is, with the background that I had, is when I began to kind of discover to discover the relationship of Islam and the environment, and when that came, which to be honest with you was slightly after I'd actually said the Shahada. I said the Shahada because I obviously I wanted to marry my wife, and I knew that was, from the background that she was from, etc., it was going to be impossible. So I had to go through a negotiation with myself of what does that mean? How do I cope with this? And it's really difficult to say this without sounding very conceited, but it was like Islam fitted into my thinking process, and I thought, I don't have any issues here.
Well, I would say this is lucky for you, because some people convert for merely getting married.
Yep.
But some, even though they do this, they take it seriously, and it changes their outlook.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely not going to, because of my relationship with God, I wasn't going to say the Shahada without it being a very serious act. But the point was that the act didn't in any way contravene anything that I already believed. And I'm also very fortunate that my family, particularly my parents, this formed no issue for them.
They welcomed it.
Well, absolutely. They love Nashwa. They love my wife, and that was fine. And I was also very sensitive towards them. So, for example, my wife said, "Look, you're going to need to, get a Muslim name." Very much for the paperwork for Saudi Arabia more than anything else. Do you know what I mean? And when I went to say my Shahada, the Imam said to me, "You want to change your name?" And my wife said, "Yes, he does, because he needs it for the paperwork." And so this worried.
What name did you take?
Well, this worried me. I didn't. I was very sensitive about my parents, and so I said I remember phoning my folks up, and I said, "Listen, I'm going to need to change my name for this paperwork." And I said, "You chose my name, and therefore the way I see your role is that you're the ones that choose my name. I'm not the one that chooses my name. You're the ones that choose my name." And I remember my mum being like, she was in floods of tears. She was very moved by that. And my wife had a list of names. And so in the end, my Muslim names, which have never really stuck with me for various reasons.
Actually, Islamically speaking, you don't have to.
Exactly, and that's what I discovered later.
It's not about the name,
but they're still quite important to me. So it's Karam, because when I was little and I had dyslexia, that I used to spell my name backwards, and it reminded my mother of that.
Mark Karam.
Yeah, and Abdullah, after my wife's dad, who passed away when she was very young, and Dawood is my brother's name, is David, so I chose those three names. But by including my parents in that, it meant that there's never been any rift between me and any members of my family or friends in doing this. Everyone's just taken it on board and either really celebrated it or just it's just what Mark is, and so that made things a lot easier. Is the fact that I've had this massive support throughout, that I already felt this way. But one of the things I said when I was saying my Shahada to the Imam, because we had to go up to Dublin, and that happened at that stage, the mosque was in Clonskea, I think, or was that the other one? Anyway, the mosque that we had to go to was a converted church, so there was this familiarity.
Oh, that's the older one,
the South Circular one, or North Circular Road, yeah. And Imam here was the Imam at the time from Sudan, and I felt very comfortable. I've got this, I've got this huge, I've been brought up with this massive respect for old African guys. So in came this old African guy, and he spoke beautifully to me. And the only question I had for him was about Islam's attitude towards the environment, and he answered beautifully and spoke to me about, a couple of examples. So the two questions I had, one was that, and he spoke to me about, if you're planting a seed in the end of days, you must carry on planting it, etc. And a couple of other, things about how we mustn't damage, things, even if we're in war, we mustn't damage the environment. And of course, the other thing is,
you don't destroy crops, you don't burn trees.
Yeah, and the other thing is, what I couldn't face was the idea that, this idea of God that didn't, that wasn't inclusive. and that, somehow all the people I knew or whatever were not part of its world. And so, and he spoke beautifully about the example of the very holy gentleman who said, even if I had, everybody said this was the holiest person they knew, and he said, even if I had, one foot in paradise, I still wouldn't feel confident.
I think that was Omar.
Yeah, Omar. And so what that said to me was, this thing of, again, with your personal relationship, and also everything is up to Allah, is
Sure.
up to His will, and that really we can only but guess and do our best.
Well, nobody enters into Jannah or paradise because of his or her personal efforts. If we are granted Jannah, it's because of the mercy of Allah.
Absolutely, and so this really resonated with me, and so I saw that I then had a role as somebody who walks the world of non-Muslims very comfortably, and I could see this kind of role as bridging what I did. So when we moved from Ireland to Wales, I started to look for roles that I could take there, and I was lucky that with the centre that I work for, and we, the Muslims that work, there's a lot of opportunities of cultural awareness for me, because I had this kind of idea that if you imagine a bunch of people working for the post office, and on a Monday they're told this guy's going to come in and talk to you about Islam, so that you've got a good idea. And you can just imagine that if somebody walks in with the thobe and the beard and everything, and unfortunately in this country the brown skin, the shutters just come down.
Yes, true.
And I thought there was an opportunity for me to walk in there and leave the shutters open just long enough to be able to start,
Oh, that's very important.
Getting an understanding. And so I
being part of the culture.
Yeah.
In order to be able to convey the message.
Yeah. I mean, I did a talk quite recently with one of the local colleges here about how they could deal with their, Muslim students and colleagues, etc. And when I'm talking about them, I do a lot of we, talking about us and how we should do this and how we should do that, as if, because I am of them as well as being Muslim, and so that work that I do, currently I'm working a lot with RE teachers in the UK, and giving them resources to help them teach Islam and everything. And I mean, I've been so touched by just how keen they are, and how their willingness to be doing the right thing and just needing the wherefore to do it. So that's what I've been doing. But at the same time, when I was doing my master's in Muslims in contemporary Britain, an opportunity came up to do a piece of work with the director of the centre around Islamic gardens, and their basically what was happening is a group came out called Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and they were doing a piece of research around something that was happening in Qatar, a Quranic garden, as a kind of type of botanic garden.
Quranic.
Yeah, only plants from the Quran. And they were they were looking at this issue of there not being enough representation of Muslims within British botanical gardens, and maybe this Quranic garden could be a step inwards. And we looked quite quickly at it and thought the Quranic garden model isn't really going to work, because firstly it's a little bit literal. It's kind of indicating that maybe a palm tree is somehow more holy than a oak tree, which we wasn't where we were going to come from. And also, it's not very Botanic Gardens Conservation International. Their big thing is around sustainability and conservation et cetera, and it didn't work with the sustainability that you'd be bringing all these plants from the Middle East and having to bring them up in heated houses, et cetera.
It's an artificial environment.
Yeah, so that wasn't going to work.
It's a very weird idea because many of the plants mentioned in the Quran were mentioned to Arabs from their own environment because they could recognize them. It wouldn't mention pineapple, for instance, or mangoes, or because they didn't know them. Maybe
it was a very strange idea, and actually, 3 weeks ago, I actually stood in that garden because it's actually come to fruition after 20 years or something finally. But yes, so then we started to look. What about Islamic gardens? Because there's this big tradition within Islamic gardens, etc. And so the piece of work that we did was seeing if Islamic gardens could, and so when I did that piece of research, that brought me into meeting Fazl Khalid, who is the founder and director of IFES Eco Islam. And he's one of the great Islamic environmental thinkers and doers, actually, taking the Islamic environmental ethic and putting it into practice, taking the theological and putting it into the practical. But of course, as I'm sure you know, the first step when dealing with Muslims is for them to know that there is an Islamic environmental ethic, and it's quite interesting that you, once you start people on this road, they just tumble over themselves. So when we do imams workshops and we talk about, the various things about Tawheed and Khalifa and Quranic verses like Surah 55 talking about the balance and weighing the balance and corruption being, upon the earth, and that we have this responsibility to take care of this environment. And the great thing about that is it's not Muslims. It's humankind.
I think this is an issue that is worth pursuing further. We want to discuss it with you in the next episodes because the time for this episode is finished.
So sorry. Did I go on to?
No, we'll have another episode.
Okay.